edition of Collection Reflection. We are standing next to our iconic portrait of General George Rogers Clark. Clark, of course, the hero of the West in the American Revolution, the sobriquets of the Hannibal of the West, the Conqueror of the Northwest, the George Washington of the West, but really in many ways the father of Kentucky. And this is a wonderful portrait. It shows up in a lot of different places. It was actually painted posthumously. Clark died in 1818. He was born in 1752. He reached the height of his fame in 1778 and 1779 with his Illinois campaign. He conducted Indian campaigns in the 1780s. By the 1790s, he was in serious financial trouble, legal trouble, all dating back to debts incurred that the government would not pay from prosecuting the war in the West during the Revolution. And it's something that he struggled with the rest of his life and that his family tried to help him with too. So he was not really treated very well by the government that he fought for, and a country that he helped double in size, because his Illinois campaign that really helped lay the U.S. claim to what was then the Northwest Territory, north and west of the Ohio River, and that eventually became 5 U.S. states, essentially doubled the size of the United States. So it was a shame that he was not treated as well as he should have been by the government. In 1809, he fell in a fire, and basically the gangrene set in his right leg, and he had to have it amputated. And that's when he moved to Locust Grove. And so many of you, of course, that are familiar with the wonderful site, historic Locust Grove here in Louisville, that was the last home of George Rogers Clark. He spent the last 9 years of his life there. This portrait is based on the 1820 John Wesley Jarvis portrait. Clark had 2 portraits painted from life. One about 1813 by a guy named Cook, who was an itinerant artist passing through Kentucky and the West. And then another, which we believe was painted in 1817 by Joseph Bush. And that one is at Locust Grove. And again, if you visited Locust Grove, many of you will have seen that there in the historic home. In 1820, John Wesley Jarvis, while he was heading down the Ohio and down the Mississippi to winter in New Orleans and to paint down there, stopped and visited the Crons at Locust Grove. And apparently, looking at that original portrait of Clark as an old man, beaten down by age, debilitated by strokes and things like that, and then based on descriptions of what Clark looked like in his prime, painted a portrait from waist view up of Clark sitting that I believe this one was based on. And it's not just me that believes it, but for many, many years, for over 125 years now, this has been attributed to Matthew H. Jouett, the famous Kentucky portrait painter. And that's where you see it in books and things like that. It usually always says by Jouett. Jouett kept a list of his paintings. Clark does not appear on that list. So either for some reason it was left off, or somebody else painted it. In an earlier edition of Collection Reflection, we talked about Zachary Taylor, and we saw the portrait done, the wonderful portrait done by him by James Reed Lambden. And one day, it's kind of like an epiphany, it hit me how much this portrait looked like the Zachary Taylor portrait. And I actually took him off the wall, set him next to Zachary Taylor's portrait, and looked at the two. And if we were to do that today, you would see how very, very similar they are. So my theory is, and I've pushed this to others and they haven't pushed back too hard anyway, that this actually was painted by James Reed Lambden in the 1830s when he had his museum here in Louisville. We talked about Lambden when we talked about Zachary Taylor, how he came from Pittsburgh to Louisville in 1832, had the museum here for 5 years before he went back to Pennsylvania, spent the rest of his career in Philadelphia. Well, it stands to reason that he would have seen the Jarvis of Clark and based this bust view of the old general and hero on that Jarvis portrait. It's slightly different than the Jarvis portrait. We actually have the Jarvis portrait here in the collection, but it was damaged when it got dunked in the Mississippi when the steamboat it was on sank before the Civil War, sometime in the antebellum period. It doesn't really look like this anymore, but one of the Wesley portraits or the Jarvis portraits that William Clark had in his family, we have a photo of it, and if you look at the two, you can see subtle differences, especially in the face, and so it stands to reason that probably another artist did that, even though some say that this is by Jarvis as well. So, a wonderful portrait of Clark, I think perhaps now should be attributed to James Reed Lambden, but officially it's still to Matthew Jouett. One of those little mysteries that we hope we can sometimes solve. We have in our collection here at the Filson too a number of not only Clark family papers, but George Rogers Clark papers. And one of our true treasures is what's called George Rogers Clark's Mason letter. And this is his report to his friend George Mason back in Virginia on the campaign to Illinois. And this is the kind of the title page. And it's a 75-page letter written by his secretary, Angus Cameron, from Louisville in November of 1779 when he'd come back from his campaigning, and it was in Louisville, at least for a time. He was back and forth a lot. But you can see in this very, very long account, he relates the Illinois campaign, which again helped lay claim for the United States to that territory north and west of the Ohio. And there on the last page, you can see where he has signed it after his secretary wrote it all out. He no doubt was dictating it to him, or he worked off of a draft. And then there's G.R. Clark, and he has a very distinctive hand. He brushed against the ink a little bit, so he isn't that. This came from the Mason family, so the provenance on it is very good. Also in the collections, a very nice letter he wrote, and I can slip this. This letter has been conserved, and it's in Japanese tissue now. But May 11th, 1792, he's writing from Beargrass, which was the settlement in what is today St. Matthews. Out that way, he probably was actually writing from Mulberry Hill, which was on the South Fork of that, so it's more in the Belknap neighborhood, Poplar Level there by Audubon Hospital and St. X is where the Clark home was. So here he's writing, he says, nothing much is going on. The Indians are spreading fire and tomahawk along the frontier, and the government isn't really doing much to stop them. Of course, the government had just had two armies very severely defeated by the Indian Confederacy there north of the Ohio in 1790 under Harmar and 1791 under St. Clair. So they were trying to kind of regroup, and then General Mad Anthony Wayne would actually put together the army that defeated the Indians 2 years later in August of 1794. So you can see it's a very long letter, very nice, all in Clark's hand. And then down on the corner there, he squeezed in his signature. So there's George Rogers Clark's signature, where you can see it's looking pretty similar to what he signed back in 1779. This is before his arthritis essentially crippled him later in life, and he's sending it to their oldest brother, the one right ahead of him, Jonathan Clark in Virginia. The Clarks have the distinction of eventually having three generals. Of course, George Rogers, Jonathan, who becomes a major general in the Virginia militia, and William, who after the expedition becomes a brigadier general in the Louisiana Territory militia. So famous Clark family, and of course really for around here, the most famous of them all, George Rogers Clark. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you come back and see another edition of Collection Reflection.